Thank you all for some really great presentations. The floor is now open for questions and also for answers. I'd like to do a quick round of 3 where nobody asks more than one question, and then we can have a second and third round, hopefully, and a lot more people can participate. So raise your hand if you'd, there you go.
Bob Poland, UMass. Thank you for excellent presentations, and I'm disappointed, Nancy, that I only get to ask one question. So since I can only ask one question, it's going to be a very broad one. So the starting with the Sans paper, the issue, undergirding it, it seems to me, is there any, if we're going to say that we as economists somehow take ourselves seriously, and not just those in this room, but generally, is there any analytic foundation to justify, or is in this literature that you're reviewing, to justify a savings-led growth model as opposed to an investment-led growth model? We know, for example, since the Feldstein and Horioka paper on savings-led growth was just wrong. It was very, very easy to demonstrate that it was wrong over and over and over again. And so we have this, very substantial literature. However one may think about the means through which you achieve an investment-led growth framework, it's clear that a so-called savings-led model doesn't perform. It's not working on the evidence. So I'm wondering if the literature that you review just kind of ignores all this, and it's operating purely at an ideological level. Similarly, with the Ortiz papers, looking at the evidence on austerity, what is supposed to be the desired outcome here? I can't imagine that in implementing austerity policies, we say, well, therefore we want to make 83% of the population worse off. And we want to make the rich people richer, even though that's what the evidence demonstrates is happening. And so that, again, is there a presentation of what the analytic arguments are as to why these are imperative? And when you went through your list of the various tax regimes that could counteract austerity, what are the analytic arguments as to why all of them are not efficacious? The only one that one could come up with consistently is that, well, because it requires taxing the rich. And so is that all that this ends up boiling down to? And I guess that would also apply to the questions, on the debates on the IMF quota. Are we all really just talking about sustaining a neoliberal model that is targeted at redistributing income and wealth upward, period? Or is there something in between that is being debated seriously at the level of the literature and policy areas that you guys have discussed?
Okay, that was actually 3 questions, so I'm going to give you all a chance to respond right away while it's fresh. You want to go first? Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. When I look at this literature, unfortunately, you're right. There's no justification for the argument that saving is driving investment, right? And in fact, that has been well established fact in endogenous money theory. That has been well established in many circles. In fact, nowadays the BIS is pushing for this. When we look at Barrio and Disyatat's works and others' works, we know that there are a lot of other people who have been aware of this. But I guess these ideas have not penetrated into IMF's inner circles, although even at IMF, there are people I know personally, for example, who are aware of these distinctions. But when it comes to, overall modeling, when it comes to overall, like policy proposals, they are going back to their, square one. That's how I see it. Yep.
Thanks for the question. If I understood correctly, you're asking which are the outcomes, and this is all about taxing the rich, and what will be the, really the alternatives. And actually, the outcomes do change country by country, but what we can see is that this template, that's the title of the session, it really comes from what traditionally has been called the Washington Consensus. It's a set of policies that do increase inequality. This is a main outcome, actually, that you are getting all over. And you talk to IMF officials, they say they're not aware of that. They really come with short-term pressures, and they need to cut, and they look everywhere they can cut, The reality is they don't look, instead of keep cutting and keep making, public budgets smaller and smaller and smaller, and therefore the private sector so smaller. What they could be looking is actually to expand it by a number of measures. And there are 9, not just taxation to the rich. These 9 options that they were mentioned there, they are fully endorsed by the international financial organizations, by the United Nations, and they have been applied by countries all over the world. So it's about being more creative, about extending fiscal space, making it larger, so you will have capacity to have investment for sustainable development, for addressing climate change, for social development, and all the other necessary things there. Civil society, at the World Social Forum, they have this lemma of, another world is possible, but indeed it is. Huh?
And just on the last question, so I think on, how do they justify this? I think we hear a lot first from them, the IMF is not a democratic institution. So this idea that it should be somewhat more democratic is just from the onset, they feel like that's not necessarily how it should be. When we hear noises from, for example, William Ruto, the president of Kenya, at the Paris summit last year, he made a proposal saying we should have systems where we put in different amounts of money because you have bigger economies, but then we should have an equal say over what happens to that. Like that's the counter proposal, right? And we've never gotten really to that place where that's how things work. Also, just finger pointing. There's a lot of US and Europeans finger pointing at each other that they're the problem and obstacle for reform here. They lie about it. IMF quota reform is incredibly untransparent. There's no papers on it. There's no real staff discussion. So for civil society or anyone to really even figure out what is happening, a lot is behind closed doors, as Isabel was also saying. And so there's a lot of pointing fingers and not being honest about what's really happening. Well, they both benefit, right? And finally, also, I think a really healthy dose of self-delusion. Like I had a conversation with a board member of the IMF the other day, and they said, yeah, we're open to some quota reform, but it has to be to changing the formula, but it has to be on an objective basis. It was never on an objective basis. From 1944 onwards, they decided first who should have the biggest vote shares and then created the formula to fit that. Like, that's what happened, right? So it's never been an objective standard. And so yeah, but that's what happens in those institutions where they're in charge. They're not challenged enough by outside voices who actually don't agree with that, right? Thanks.
Great. So I'm seeing a lot of hands. So raise your hand if you want to speak. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so we'll take 5, but please be brief so that we can fit everybody in.
I have one question for the first presenter, for Hassan, regarding the formula for the debt sustainability analysis with the external sector. The formulas that I've seen with the external sector, they include foreign debt on the left-hand side of the equation, the share of total debt, the international rate of interest, foreign prices and nominal exchange rate. And yet the conclusion is always that I've seen that that the sustainability problem is due to excess government spending. That it's domestic, it's never external. Do you think this is because of the way the formula is constructed?
Hi, Mabrouk Mbarak from Sociology. I thought the panel was really great. Everything fitted really together. And what I wanted to say was, it was more a comment really than a question. But there's so many studies showing the IMF, everything they're doing is just not working, right? And Emma's presentation at the end is pointing to the elephant in the room, right? So maybe it is time to think about the elephant in the room. I was part of the negotiation team negotiating with the IMF in Tunisia about the debt. And there's two puzzles. Every time they came to the parliament, uninvited, by the way, they would come and they like impose themselves and be really like pressuring us to do things. There are two things that it was really bothered sitting there. The first thing, they're like telling me, you have a deficit and you need this loan. I'm like, my deficit is in Tunisian dinars. You are giving me this basket of currency. What am I going to do with this? And I was linking it to the governor of the central bank. When we were doing the budget, the governor of the central bank told us, you know, this is the end of the year. You know what's happening in the central bank? There are a lot of companies knocking on my door because they're like, I have this profit and I don't want it in dinars. I want it in euros, so you'd better exchange it. So we were like, oh, okay, we're going to limit this. And the IMF said, no, you can't do this. This is capital control. If you do that, and sure enough, we had problems because, like Jan Kregel said, it's a really big mafia. There's not just the IMF. There's so many institutions. You do one move and they go after you. So it's really real, like once you're in the room. So the other thing that I wanted to say is, there's so many things to say. The other thing that bothered me was like, they said you have to cut your subsidies. I said, well, you know that 70% of our trade is with Europe. Once you tell the French to stop, the French government to stop subsidizing the grapes and the cheese, and you tell the Italian to stop subsidizing the olive oil, then I'll start. But the problem is there's never a dialectic, and I feel like all the research we do, we're showing the IMF is doing the bad job in that country, in that region, but we're not showing, by doing this, what does it do to France? What does it do to the US? What does it do? That dialectic is always missing. And I think Emma is giving us an invitation that all of us start to turn our gaze towards the big elephant in the room, which is the empire. We need to do our research to show what it does to them, what it produced to them. We know it's producing so horrible things for us. When I was in parliament, I was a member of parliament in Tunisia, our debt was like 60% of GDP. It's like 80% now. It's crazy. So I think it was just a comment to say, what I saw in Tunisia is pointing to what Emma is inviting us. Even though you didn't say it, the elephant in the room is really huge here. So this was my rant, comment, and invitation as well. Thank you all.
Thank you. A really great panel. Question on the IMF, since you seem to really know the institution well, something I never really understood, this exceptional access rules where they ask the board for to agree to exceptional access even when they cannot prove that there is market access. The mic, okay. There is a bunch of situations, closer even?
Tilt it more. Tilt it.
I like this.
No,
I like
no,
this.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, situation they call gray zones. If a country doesn't have a lot of debt, just a liquidity problem is very easy. If it has too much debt, the DSA would say they need debt reduction, but countries in the middle are the hardest. So this is where they play games and they try to avoid the rescheduling or restructuring. And they call them the gray zones. And there have been several board papers to address this. One is the too early, I forgot. Too little, too late. Thank you. The famous too little, too late, which was rejected at the board basically by the U.S. So the question of the veto is important there. But staff has tried to discipline the institution on these situations and has failed. And there are 3 other board papers like this. And so, it goes back to the composition of the board. And these are the situations where there is a lot of austerity because basically you have enormous financing gaps and you don't want restructuring. So these, in order to impose or to help the staff push for a rule that is more strict, it seems to me, one shouldn't say only no austerity, but we have to go further and define the kind of incompressible spending that shouldn't be touched or taxed, more norms on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in order to reduce that uncertainty and push for many more restructurings when needed. So, is there a problem in terms of voting on the board to get this, given that there's been quite a few attempts?
Yeah, I don't really have a question. I'm just gonna cheerlead too. I just thought this was a great panel at the GDP Center. We try to organize our work on what we see as the sort of 3 fundamental problems that need to be fixed in the system. Is one, that it needs to be bigger. We need a stepwise increase in finance to have the kind of structural transformation we need and to build a safety net for the bumps in the road that are inevitably going to happen. But 2, we've got to fundamentally change the delivery that make these institutions better, because on the development bank side, they're not associated with growth, they're not doing the right thing, and obviously they roll you backwards when it comes to the IMF. And number 3, we need more voice and representation for the poor. And so you folks just put the whole thing together. I have a plea, right? And basically what Emma's saying here is that we need an inside and an outside game. And you're all talking about that. And so on the inside, all of this stuff is on the table. So the DSA is under review right now. And so Hassan, I'd love to cite your paper. We've got a whole project on this, and we're making interventions, and really encourage you to. Obviously, Isabel, that there's in July, I think it is the conditionality review of this. And Emma, as you said, the new formula is on the table. But obviously, whispering in the ears of princes is not going to be the only way to get this happen. And there needs to be an outside civil society game, but also a global South governance game. And the quota, equiproportional quota thing has really been a lightning bolt in the global South. We were just in China, and they are just, they are so panicked that this could be a precedent for the MDBs and so forth. And that the G24, if you look at their communique, they really saw this as delegitimizing the system, right? To take the rules that the U.S. wrote. I'm a recovering American here. We wrote the rules, and then we just threw the formula out to be able to do this. That's had a real legitimacy blow, and that's a big reason why there is a conversation for a new formula. But as someone who's been, flies to Washington too much, when the new formulas these guys are going to come up with are going to be moving you hundreds of decimal points, and so we need bold stuff on the outside. Andres Arawas, who was invited here today but couldn't make it, he's got this totally out of the box thing on how to redo quotas based on your emissions and so forth. But that kind of stuff is important, right? And but what are things in the middle there that need to be done are key. Hassan, just my last comment on DSAs. We need a really good DSA to mobilize the kind of finance we need for climate and development. Right, we have to be mobilizing finance for 25 to 50 years to change the structure of the world economy, and we can't afford to have 3 years step forward and then 3 years stepping backward. And so this tool, as Bob said, hey, we're a lot of economists in the room here. This is one of the only things that the economists do that actually matters. This is the heart of debt restructuring negotiations, and it's a key tool for examining the extent to which countries can finance things. And as you so eloquently showed, it's completely built to say once you hit some arbitrary limit, you absolutely have to move into Isabel's presentation and cut into austerity. We just can't do that. And it can be calibrated as a tool if you just relax, and we did this in a study for Colombia and Peru, if you just relax the assumption that there's an automatic kickback for austerity and say, okay, well, if you have a certain spending need, there are different ways to do it. Like, what is the mix of interest rates and grants and debt relief, et cetera, that could get you and keep you on that pathway? It's a very different model, right? It's an investment-led model, and it's not something you can tweak on this particular thing. But that's what we need. That's what countries need. I know UNCTAD is working on such a thing, but we need this tool. Sorry.
No, okay. No, this is slightly different. How much of this austerity actually occurs under IMF programs? The reason I'm asking that is that, increasingly middle-income countries, they're not taking IMF loans. I mean, unless you get into a debt crisis, which is different. But otherwise, you don't take an IMF loan. But we know that they go through austerity, which essentially means possibly that so long as you have legacy foreign financial capital within your jurisdictions, because, I mean, you switch on a television in any of those countries and it'll say, oh, the fiscal deficit is too high. Because basically, global finance doesn't like a proactive state which uses the fiscal lever. So if that be the case, then what we are, it's true that the IMF's role becomes important in poor countries, and it becomes important in countries which actually have a debt crisis where the IMF comes as the mediator between foreign finance and the government. In other cases, whether the IMF is there or not, we actually have countries which embrace foreign capital also embrace austerity. So we really are looking, therefore, at a set of enemies who are much more complex than just the IMF.
First, I want to read out a question from Jomo, who has typed it in. Reforming IMF governance requires better understanding of its history. In 1944, the quota votes were barely over half. By 2010, it was over 88%. There was no rationale for this change. The US will fight to retain its veto, while the EU will fight to include the trade basis for the size of their quota, although they have a common market. The US and EU are opposed on these and other issues, which is the basis for directing the reform. But this is not, or this is a very bad time for dividing to reform. To fight for such changes for obvious political reasons. There is much more to use in a campaign for IMF governance reform. And so now can I quickly add my question? So just want to Hassan about, one of the things that seems obvious to me that the IMF misses out is in its assessment for future GDP, it leaves out the contractionary implications of its own conditions, because it tries to pretend there aren't any contractionary implications, which, Isabel, etc., will tell you that there are. So just on that one. And Emma, in relation to all of this, and I agree with Jomo, there are many things to fight for, which you also mentioned in terms of, delinking quota from other allocations and so on. But internal versus external pressure, yes, we can all go to these World Bank and Spring and etc. meetings, and I increasingly feel that this is like a little bit of a pressure cooker valve for NGOs to let off steam, and they carry on doing what they're doing inside the room. So the real thing to me is outside pressure. Nothing happens without it. Even the US and EU going to UN tax committee came because of digital services taxation by other countries. So I'm wondering the kinds of things that other groups and countries and mobilization can happen in terms of outside pressure, which is not just about now guys be good, be decent, be minimally just, etc. But we are developing an alternative system for whether it is trade finance or it is something else or something else, because that does concentrate the minds a little better.
Okay, we're going to go give each of the speakers time to respond, and we'll go in reverse order.
So me first. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So first, I'll pick up on the question from the colleague in Tunisia. I just want to share some research that I think Kevin also highlighted by Stubbs and Kantikalanis from a little while back that was making exactly this link between quota holdings in the fund and austerity measures. So they looked at IMF austerity recommendations for the last 10 years, and one of their findings is that borrowing countries are less likely to face required austerity if they are strongly tied to Western Europe, either through trade or diplomatic channels, or if they receive significant aid from non-OECD countries. And another finding in an accompanying paper they did was that borrowing countries are more likely to face austerity if they are host to significant foreign direct investment, particularly from Western Europe. So just to share that I think you're on the right track, that kind of research we need a bit more of. Also, just to say on exceptional access limits, and sort of echoing what Kevin said in terms of folks getting involved when there are openings to input into these processes inside the fund on inside strategies. So the IMF's Independent Evaluation Office is actually conducting a review on exceptional access limits policies in the fund, and it has a focus on even-handedness of how that policy has been applied. They're just starting that work. They have they're opening a consultation for anyone who's interested on May 13th. I'm helping to organize it. So for anyone here who works on issues like that, those invitations are open, especially for folks who are here in the room who do this type of research. You're really, really welcome. Please come and share your work and perspectives on issues like that. Just finally on the outside strategies, Jayati, I can't agree with you more. The reasons I think why we've even gotten that forward guidance on the 17th now is not because of any pressure inside the halls of the IMF, because I can tell you nobody is pressuring them on quotas. Nobody. There's literally nobody there. Brazil was complaining, that they were the only country even inside their decision-making rooms to pressure them. So the only reason why we've gotten as far as we have, which isn't very far, is because of what's happening in places like FFD and other outside places where we are talking about alternative forms, which is reaching capitals and is worrying them. So yeah, we need to do both for sure. Thank you.
Yes, responding to Chandru and others, the reality is that this template, this austerity template, adjustment template, is actually done by countries that are not even in debt distress or anything. There are countries, it's done by the majority of world countries simply because people at the Ministry of Finance perceive that this is the right way to move ahead. Now, you have to think, as Chandra was saying, this is a much more complex environment than in the 1980s, when it was an adjustment imposed on governments and with conditionalities. And now, it is true that a number of countries in the world do have IMF programs with conditionalities, but the reality is that the majority are doing it anyway because this is perceived as the right thing to do. Now, why? Because Ministry of Finance officials are trained in neoliberal universities that don't teach any alternative, and on the other hand, the IMF themselves trains them for weeks in five-star hotels, regional trainings, global trainings, sub-regional trainings on general topics, different taxation topics, you name it. And then they call them twice a year to go to Washington when they get lavishly treated, and they get, BBC presentators, interviewing them and things like that. So they think this is the right thing to do. So we're fighting an ideology which is much more difficult than not fighting a conditionality imposed. So that's where we have ahead, and that's where we have to work. And just a positive news that I think all of you may enjoy is in the last spring meetings in Washington, with a number of us were there, the Brazilian government announced that they're going to take to the G20 a proposal to tax 2% of wealth. This is a proposal that has been worked in ICRIT and with support of George Stiglitz and others, Jose Antonio Campo and others. And it is very important that it's taken to the G20. Whether the G20 will endorse it or not is another issue. But at least this is just breaking the waves. So that is very good. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for... Can I just use this one? I guess it is easier for me to use this one. Yep. So, all these questions are related to each other, in fact. So, Esteban, I guess when I look at this equation, you can write it in different ways, in nominal ways, in ratio, in terms of ratios, in terms of real, variables, so you can introduce prices, etc. But overall, there are two main things here going on. Maybe not the fact that the equation is wrong, but because of the fact that I feel that's my understanding. So the inputs are coming from some in-house models, which are mysterious in many ways because we don't know really the exact nature of these models. We know some models, like some of them are published, but some of them are basically, coming from stuff calculations which are not public. So, for example, exchange rate projections, interest rates, growth rate projections, right? So, B, and this question is related to, I guess, many other questions, feedback mechanism, we don't know how much they are considering the feedback mechanism coming from austerity. Because imagine a model, and we know how these nucleus growth models are working. So when there's a public expenditure cut, that model will not show this multiple, maybe it can show in the short run multiplier effect a bit, depending on how you basically design that model. But in the long run, these are projections for medium and long runs, that effect will disappear by definition because the model doesn't have any sort of mechanism which will incorporate this negative feedback mechanism into the projection, I guess. So, and then, about all other things, Kevin, I guess you are absolutely right in terms of when you argue that, yes, we need to think of different ways, and your exercise is also a nice way of, I guess, expanding that framework, because your framework is basically introducing some other considerations, but I guess over there we need to also consider how other inputs are estimated and are basically projected. Last but not least, yes, Chandru, the IMF is not the only institution which is imposing this austerity, and overall this is part of the general consensus, right? But the IMF is basically, representing the general consensus. That's why it is important to discuss these things in terms of IMF practices, but of course it is not enough to just point out IMF as the, authority imposing or, spreading this word. This is part of the general, I guess, intellectual milieu, political milieu, and then that is regenerating the same outcome, unfortunately. Thanks.
I'm going to ask I know there's more questions and eagerness to talk about it. I'll ask the panelists to stick around for a couple of minutes if you want to come up after, but I feel like we've earned our break, and this is a terrific panel. Please give them a hand. Thank you.
Nancy, thank you so much. In fact, it was 1.5 hours because we started late. So you did keep absolute time. Guys, listen, can you come back in 10 minutes, please? Please come back in 10 minutes.